Hey guys, tonight I will take you through the history of Great Britain. From ancient battles to the rise of an empire that spanned the globe, the story of Great Britain is one of triumph, tragedy, and transformation. This is a tale of kings and queens, revolution and resilience, of culture and conquest that shaped not just a nation, but the entire world. Join us as we journey through the centuries, uncovering the key moments that defined the destiny of a nation. Welcome to the history of Great Britain. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to know who's joining us and from what part of the globe. Now, dim the lights and stay relaxed to this exciting piece as I put you through to deep sleep. The first breath of Britain is a breath that echoes through the ages. It is the sound of the land in its purest form, wild, untamed, and untouched. Before the roar of armies and the clash of crowns, before cities rose from the dust and stone, there was Britain, a land of mist and fog, where nature reigned supreme. It was a world where time moves differently, where the seasons dictated the rhythms of life and survival. Imagine standing on a cliff, looking out at the churning sea, the wind biting at your face, and the vast unknown stretching out in front of you. This was the world of the first inhabitants of Britain, ancient, primal, and uncertain. The story of Britain begins not with kings or emperors, but with the land itself. The first people to set foot on its shores were not the ones we would remember in history books, but the ones whose lives were simple, yet deeply connected to the world around them. These were the ancient Britons, the Celts, whose tribes roamed the hills and valleys of this isolated island. They lived by their own codes, worshipped their own gods, and followed the laws of nature. They were the foundation on which everything would be built. And yet, their world was as fragile as it was fierce. In the early years of Britain's history, it was not a kingdom, but a tapestry of tribes, each with its own customs, its own territories, and its own way of life. They did not have the sprawling cities or the ironclad fortresses that would one day define Britain. But what they had was a profound connection to the land. They worshipped the earth, the water, and the sky, believing that the gods were all around them, in every whisper of the wind and every crack of thunder. Their belief in the sacredness of nature would shape their lives in ways that are still felt today. But this world, as it always does, was not meant to last. In 55 BC, the quiet shores of Britain were disturbed by the first sighting of Roman ships. Julius Caesar had cast his eyes upon this land, and like a storm on the horizon, he was determined to bring it under the control of Rome. The Celts had fought with fierce bravery, but they were no match for the might of the Roman legions. The Romans brought with them a world unlike anything the Britons had ever known, a world of stone walls, paved roads, and order where chaos had once reigned. The Romans were not just conquerors, they were architects of the empire, and in their wake, they left an indelible mark on the land they sought to control. When Caesar first arrived, the island's people were divided, their loyalties scattered among the various Celtic tribes. But as the Romans began their conquest, it became clear that unity would not come easily. For all their strengths, the Romans faced resistance from the native tribes. And one name would forever be etched in British memory: Boudica. The queen of the Iceni tribe, she led a revolt against the Romans in 60 AD, gathering an army of tens of thousands of Britons in a desperate attempt to reclaim their land. Her fury, sparked by personal loss and the brutality of the Roman forces, drove her to one of the most iconic uprisings in British history. Boudica's rebellion was ultimately crushed, but her defiance left a legacy of resistance that would echo through the centuries. The Romans, though victorious, would never fully tame the spirit of the land. Even as they built their roads, their towns, and their forts, they could not erase the memory of the Celts. The Roman occupation of Britain, which lasted for nearly 400 years, left behind roads that would guide future generations, towns that would grow into cities, and the cultural foundation that would one day become the heart of the British Empire. Yet, for all the Roman accomplishments, they too would fall. The empire that had conquered so much of the known world could not hold on to Britain forever. By the early 5th century, the Roman Empire was in decline. It was a time of upheaval, of chaos, and of change. As the empire withdrew from Britain, the land was left to fend for itself. What followed was a period of darkness, a time when Britain was divided and vulnerable. The once great empire that had shaped the world now left the island in the hands of its native people, who had to rise once again to protect their land from new invaders. It was in this vacuum of power that the Anglo-Saxons began to arrive. Driven by a mixture of necessity and opportunity, these warriors from the north began to settle on the shores of Britain, carving out new kingdoms where the old Celtic tribes had once flourished. With them came a new way of life, a new language, and a new set of customs. The Anglo-Saxons were not just invaders, they were settlers, bringing their culture, their laws, and their gods with them. They did not simply take control, they integrated themselves into the fabric of Britain, creating something new, something that was both native and foreign at the same time. The Anglo-Saxon period was one of great change, but it was also a time of unity. The island, once fragmented and divided into rival tribal territories, began to take shape as a more unified kingdom. The early Anglo-Saxon kings ruled over the various territories, slowly consolidating power and expanding their influence. But they were not without their challenges. The land was still filled with pockets of resistance, and the old Celtic traditions would not fade quietly into the past. The Celts, though displaced, still held sway in certain parts of the island, particularly in the west and in what we now know as Wales. It was in this land that the Celtic spirit would find its last stronghold, even as the Anglo-Saxons laid the foundations for a new Britain. But the Anglo-Saxons were not the only ones eyeing Britain. As the island began to stabilize, the sea brought with it a new threat: the Vikings. By the late 8th century, the first Viking raids began to strike the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. These seafaring warriors from the north were not just interested in plunder, they were interested in conquest. The Vikings came in waves, attacking towns and villages with brutal efficiency. The Anglo-Saxons fought back, but the Vikings were relentless. It was not long before the Norsemen established a foothold in the north and east of Britain, creating the Danelaw, a Viking-controlled territory that would be a constant thorn in the side of Anglo-Saxon England. The Viking Age, as it came to be known, was a time of great violence, but also of great cultural exchange. The Vikings, like the Anglo-Saxons before them, brought their own customs, their own language, and their own way of life to Britain. The Anglo-Saxons, though they resisted, could not entirely remove the Vikings from their land. The two cultures would influence one another, leaving a legacy that would shape Britain for centuries to come. As the centuries passed, the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings were eventually able to coexist in some parts of the island. But the threat of Viking raids and invasions never fully disappeared. It was not until the 11th century that the next great chapter in Britain's history would begin to unfold. In 1066, Britain was poised on the precipice of another monumental change, one that would reshape the island and set its course for centuries to come. The battle for the English throne began not in the halls of a grand castle, but on the blood-soaked fields of Hastings. At the heart of this struggle were two men, Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon King of England, and William, the Duke of Normandy, a ruler of the northern French territories. Their fates were intertwined not just by blood, but by a complex web of ambition, power, and destiny. Harold had ascended to the throne after the death of King Edward the Confessor in January 1066. Though Edward had promised the crown to Harold, a distant relative, William believed that he had a legitimate claim to the throne. With his forces at the ready, William set sail from Normandy in the summer of 1066, determined to claim what he believed was rightfully his. The arrival of his invasion force signaled the start of one of the most pivotal conflicts in British history. For Harold, it had been a year filled with conflict. The sudden appearance of the Vikings, led by Harold Hardrada, in the north, had required his immediate attention. After successfully defeating the Viking army at Stamford Bridge in September, Harold's forces were exhausted and vulnerable. Barely having time to regroup, Harold had to face William's Norman army in the south. The Battle of Hastings was fought on October 14, 1066, a day that would become the defining moment of English history. The battle itself was brutal. Harold, who had fought with determination and skill throughout his life, was struck down by an arrow to the eye, an image that would become immortalized in the tapestry that bears witness to this tragic day. With his death, the Anglo-Saxon resistance crumbled, and the path to the throne was cleared for William. The victor's claims were immediately recognized, and on Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England, taking the name William I, or William the Conqueror. The world that Harold had fought to protect was now lost, and a new era of rule had begun. William's conquest was not just a military victory. It was a cultural and social revolution. The Normans, with their superior military organization, quickly imposed their rule over the English countryside. William knew that to truly solidify his claim, he needed more than just military dominance. He needed a complete restructuring of English society. The feudal system, which had been commonplace in Normandy and much of France, was introduced in England. This system divided the land into fiefs, with the king at the top, followed by his loyal barons, knights, and vassals. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, many of whom had been loyal to Harold, were dispossessed, and their lands were given to the Norman invaders. Castles were built across the land, serving as both military fortifications and symbols of Norman authority. England was no longer ruled by its native kings and nobles. It was now a part of the vast Norman Empire. William's imposition of the feudal system altered the very structure of English society. It centralized power in the hands of the king and his chosen lords, while reducing the rights and freedoms of the common people. The English peasantry, once semi-independent under the Anglo-Saxons, found themselves bound to the land, working for the Norman lords in exchange for protection. For many, life became an unending struggle for survival, as they faced not only the demands of their Norman masters, but also the harsh realities of medieval life. Yet, despite the brutality of the conquest and the dislocation of the native population, William's reign marked the beginning of the transformation of England into a united kingdom. Under the Normans, England was forged into a centralized, more organized state. The creation of the Domesday Book, a vast survey of the land, its people and its resources, was one of William's first and most important acts. This book, the first of its kind in the world, catalogued the wealth and power of the kingdom, allowing William to efficiently govern and extract taxes. The Domesday Book is a testament not only to William's ambition, but to the efficiency of the Norman system. For all his success in consolidating power, William's rule was not without its challenges. The Saxon heartlands, particularly in the north, continued to resist Norman control, and in 1069, the English rose up in rebellion. In response, William resorted to what would become one of the most infamous acts of his reign, the harrying of the North. Between 1069 and 1070, William sent his forces to ravage the northern counties, burning villages, killing peasants, and destroying crops. The landscape was left desolate, and the people broken. The rebellion was crushed, but at a terrible cost. It left a lasting scar on the relationship between the native English population and their new Norman rulers. The Plantagenets and the evolution of monarchy. As the dust settled from William the Conqueror's victory, the Kingdom of England began to settle into its new reality. William's immediate successors were strong rulers, yet the foundation for the next phase of England's history lay in the emergence of a new dynasty, the Plantagenets. The Plantagenets, a family of French origin, would go on to rule England for over 300 years, overseeing some of the most dramatic and turbulent periods in British history. Their reigns marked the beginning of England's transformation from a fractured land of rival kingdoms into a unified, powerful state. The rise of the Plantagenets began in the mid-12th century with the ascension of Henry II, a king whose reign would bring both triumph and tragedy to the kingdom. Henry II was a man of great ambition, ruling over an empire that spanned not only England, but also vast territories in France, including Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. His kingdom was one of the most powerful in Europe, and his reign would set the stage for the English monarchy's long struggle to assert its dominance over both the nobility and the church. Henry II's reign was marked by his attempts to centralize power and establish a strong legal system. He created royal courts that would serve as the foundation for the English common law system, a legacy that would endure for centuries. But for all his accomplishments, Henry's reign was also marred by internal conflict, most notably with his once loyal friend and ally, Thomas Becket. Becket, who had been appointed Archbishop of Canterbury by Henry, soon found himself at odds with the king over the role of the church in England's political affairs. Henry, seeking to assert control over the church, found himself in a bitter struggle with Becket, who became a staunch defender of ecclesiastical independence. The conflict culminated in 1170 when Becket was brutally murdered by 4 of Henry's knights in Canterbury Cathedral. The murder shocked the kingdom and led to a crisis of conscience for Henry. Though he claimed no responsibility, the king was forced to face the consequences of his actions, and the church's power over the monarchy was strengthened as a result. Becket's martyrdom turned him into a symbol of resistance to royal authority, and his death marked the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between the monarchy and the church. As Henry's reign continued, his power grew, but so did the challenges he faced. The nobility, wary of his growing authority, began to push back, and the royal family was plagued by internal strife. Henry's sons, driven by their own ambitions, rebelled against their father, leading to a series of civil wars that tore the kingdom apart. The Plantagenets, despite their early success, would soon find themselves embroiled in the struggle for power and survival, a struggle that would shape the future of England. The Wars of the Roses and the birth of the Tudor dynasty. The seeds of the Wars of the Roses were planted in the complex and volatile soil of the late 14th century. By the time Richard II, the last Plantagenet king of England, came to the throne, the once mighty family had fractured, divided by the ambitions of powerful noble houses and the weight of a monarchy that had begun to buckle under its own complexity. Richard, young and ill-prepared to manage the delicate balance of power in his court, was ultimately dethroned in 1399 by Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. This marked the beginning of the Lancaster branch of the Plantagenet family's rule, but the crown's legitimacy was questioned, sowing the seeds of discord that would last for decades. As the Lancastrian kings struggled to maintain their tenuous hold on the throne, a new contender emerged. The rival York faction, another branch of the Plantagenet family, seized upon the perceived weakness of the Lancasters. The stage was set for a deadly struggle between these two houses, each claiming the right to rule England. This conflict, known as the Wars of the Roses, would ravage the kingdom for much of the 15th century. A war fought not just for land, but for the very soul of the nation itself. The conflict was brutal, fueled by blood feuds, political ambition, and the hunger for power. The houses of Lancaster and York were no strangers to rivalry. And as the war raged on, the line between family loyalty and national loyalty grew increasingly blurred. Each battle was not only a contest of military strategy, but also a clash of personal ambition and royal bloodlines. The most famous of these battles, the Battle of Towton in 1461, would become the bloodiest of the war, with thousands falling on both sides. At Towton, the Yorkists, led by Edward IV, emerged victorious, solidifying their control over the throne and beginning a brief period of Yorkist dominance. But the war was far from over. The Lancastrians, though defeated, were not easily vanquished. They regrouped under the leadership of Henry Tudor, a distant relative of the Lancasters, who had spent much of the war in exile. With the support of disillusioned Yorkists, Henry raised an army and returned to England in 1485. His forces met those of the last Yorkist king, Richard III, at the Battle of Bosworth Field. The outcome of this battle would forever alter the course of England's history. Richard III, fighting for his crown, was defeated, and with his death, the Yorkist line came to an end. Henry Tudor, now Henry VII, claimed the throne and ushered in the Tudor dynasty, ending the bloody conflict that had torn England apart for so long. The establishment of the Tudor monarchy brought with it both hope and uncertainty. Henry VII, though victorious, knew that his reign was fragile. To secure his position, he married Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses and symbolizing the end of the conflict. Yet, the scars of the Wars of the Roses were deep, and Henry's reign would be marked by constant efforts to consolidate power and ensure the stability of his new dynasty. The Tudor monarchy would, in time, become one of the most iconic in British history, but its foundations were built on the bloodshed and betrayal of the Wars of the Roses. Despite the challenges, Henry VII managed to stabilize England after the turmoil of the war. His efforts to strengthen the monarchy, secure the royal finances, and ensure peace with Europe laid the groundwork for the rise of the Tudor dynasty. His son, Henry VIII, would go on to become one of the most famous and controversial monarchs in British history, and his reign would shape England in ways that would be felt for centuries to come. The reign of Henry VIII and the creation of the Church of England. When Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, he inherited a kingdom that was fractured, yet ripe for change. His father, Henry VII, had secured the monarchy after the devastating Wars of the Roses, but England remained in a delicate state of balance. Henry VIII, by contrast, was a king brimming with youthful energy and ambition. He sought to secure his legacy, and, in doing so, would reshape England's political, religious, and cultural landscape. At the start of his reign, Henry was a man of the Renaissance, a scholar, a musician, a lover of the arts and sports. He was well educated and deeply involved in the intellectual currents of his time. But his reign would quickly evolve from one of cultural patronage to one of conflict, power struggles, and ultimately, religious revolution. It was his marriage to Catherine of Aragon that set in motion the most defining and consequential aspect of his reign. Catherine, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, had been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, who had died shortly after their marriage. After Arthur's death, Catherine married Henry, but after nearly 2 decades of marriage, Catherine failed to provide Henry with a male heir. The king's desperate desire for a male successor drove him to seek an annulment of his marriage to Catherine. When Pope Clement VII refused to grant the annulment, Henry's desire to control his own fate led to a break with the Roman Catholic Church. The establishment of the Tudor monarchy brought with it both hope and uncertainty. Henry VII, though victorious, knew that his reign was fragile. To secure his position, he married Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses and symbolizing the end of the conflict. Yet, the scars of the Wars of the Roses were deep, and Henry's reign would be marked by constant efforts to consolidate power and ensure the stability of his new dynasty. The Tudor monarchy would, in time, become one of the most iconic in British history, but its foundations were built on the bloodshed and betrayal of the Wars of the Roses. Despite the challenges, Henry VII managed to stabilize England after the turmoil of the war. His efforts to strengthen the monarchy, secure the royal finances, and ensure peace with Europe laid the groundwork for the rise of the Tudor dynasty. His son, Henry VIII, would go on to become one of the most famous and controversial monarchs in British history, and his reign would shape England in ways that would be felt for centuries to come. The reign of Henry VIII and the creation of the Church of England. When Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, he inherited a kingdom that was fractured, yet ripe for change. His father, Henry VII, had secured the monarchy after the devastating Wars of the Roses, but England remained in a delicate state of balance. Henry VIII, by contrast, was a king brimming with youthful energy and ambition. He sought to secure his legacy, and, in doing so, would reshape England's political, religious, and cultural landscape. At the start of his reign, Henry was a man of the Renaissance, a scholar, a musician, a lover of the arts and sports. He was well educated and deeply involved in the intellectual currents of his time. But his reign would quickly evolve from one of cultural patronage to one of conflict, power struggles, and ultimately, religious revolution. It was his marriage to Catherine of Aragon that set in motion the most defining and consequential aspect of his reign. Catherine, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, had been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, who had died shortly after their marriage. After Arthur's death, Catherine married Henry, but after nearly 2 decades of marriage, Catherine failed to provide Henry with a male heir. The king's desperate desire for a male successor drove him to seek an annulment of his marriage to Catherine. When Pope Clement VII refused to grant the annulment, Henry's desire to control his own fate led to a break with the Roman Catholic Church. In 1534, Henry VIII, frustrated with the Pope's refusal to annul his marriage, established the Church of England, marking one of the most significant moments in British religious history. Through the act of supremacy, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church in England, thus severing ties with the Vatican and the Roman Catholic Church. This bold move was not just a religious declaration, it was a political and personal one. By establishing the Church of England, Henry consolidated his power, giving himself control over both the throne and the Church. This split from Rome would lead to a period of religious turbulence in England, as successive monarchs would grapple with the balance between Catholicism and Protestantism. Henry's marital troubles didn't end with Catherine. In his quest for a male heir, he married 5 more times, each marriage adding layers of political intrigue, personal betrayal, and religious conflict. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, provided him with a daughter, Elizabeth, but failed to deliver the long-awaited male heir. Anne's fall from favor and subsequent execution in 1536 is one of the most infamous episodes in English history, reflecting Henry's ruthless pursuit of power and his willingness to reshape the world around him to suit his desires. Henry's religious reforms including the dissolution of monasteries across England, marked a deep shift in the country's religious and political landscape. The wealth and land of the Catholic Church were seized, and the king's control over the church strengthened. But this transformation was not without its cost. The English people, many of whom had long been devoted to Catholicism, struggled with the changes. Religious tensions flared, and the country was plunged into turmoil as Protestant and Catholic factions battled for control. The Reformation in England, catalyzed by Henry's personal desires, had set England on a path of religious upheaval that would last for centuries. Despite the instability his actions caused, Henry VIII's reign also saw significant cultural and political growth. The English monarchy became one of the most powerful institutions in Europe, with the crown securing its place in history. However, the personal and religious turmoil Henry instigated would leave an indelible mark on his descendants, particularly his daughter, Elizabeth I, whose reign would come to define the Elizabethan era and the emergence of England as a world power. The Elizabethan era and the rise of the British Empire. Elizabeth I, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, inherited a kingdom marked by political instability, religious conflict, and national uncertainty. Her father's break from Rome had left England divided, and her sister, Mary I, had attempted to restore Catholicism to the country, leading to her infamous persecution of Protestants. Elizabeth, however, was different. She emerged as a strong, intelligent, and pragmatic ruler who would go on to become one of the most influential monarchs in British history. Elizabeth's reign, which lasted from 1558 to 1603, is often seen as a golden age for England. Her victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588 secured England's place as a major maritime power. Under her leadership, the English Navy grew in strength, and England began to expand its influence overseas, laying the groundwork for the British Empire. The defeat of the Armada marked the end of Spain's dominance of the seas and established England as a rising force in Europe. Elizabeth's shrewd political maneuvering, her mastery of diplomacy, and her ability to unite the country under a common cause helped her secure the throne and maintain stability in a period of great uncertainty. The Elizabethan era was also a time of cultural flourishing. It was during this time that England experienced a renaissance of the arts, with figures such as William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser defining the cultural landscape. Shakespeare's plays, which delved into the complexities of human nature, politics, and power, became emblematic of the period. The theater blossomed, and England became a center of artistic achievement. But Elizabeth's reign was not without its challenges. While she had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of European politics, the internal tensions within England were ever present. The question of succession loomed over her reign, with no heir to the throne. The religious divide between Catholics and Protestants continued to simmer, and England's economic stability was always precarious. Nevertheless, Elizabeth's legacy endures, and her reign set the stage for the emergence of Britain as a global power. The Stuart dynasty and the rise of constitutional monarchy. The death of Elizabeth I in 1603 marked the end of the Tudor dynasty and the beginning of a new chapter in British history. Without a direct heir, Elizabeth's death threw the kingdom into uncertainty. Her closest relative, James VI of Scotland, a Stuart, succeeded her as James I of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. This union of the two crowns, Scotland and England, was a momentous event, but it would not be without its challenges. The Stuart dynasty, though united in blood, would find itself constantly at odds with Parliament, the people, and, ultimately, the very concept of monarchy itself. James I, though intellectually curious and well-versed in European politics, proved to be an ineffective ruler. He had inherited a kingdom that was deeply divided, with religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants still simmering beneath the surface. His belief in the divine right of kings, that monarchs were appointed by God and had absolute authority over their realms, put him at odds with the growing power of Parliament, which had begun to see itself as a check on the monarch's power. The Stuart kings, with their sense of divine right, were ill-prepared for the challenges of governance in a rapidly changing world. James's son, Charles I, inherited his father's belief in absolute monarchy, and his reign became the stage for one of the most intense and destructive struggles in British history, the English Civil War. By the time Charles I ascended to the throne in 1625, tensions between the monarchy and Parliament were already at a boiling point. Charles, like his father, believed that kings were answerable only to God, and he sought to rule without the interference of Parliament. But the power of Parliament had grown significantly during the reign of Elizabeth, and Charles's attempts to bypass it were met with fierce resistance. The conflict between Charles and Parliament escalated, and by 1642, England was plunged into civil war. The English Civil War was not just a political struggle, it was a war for the future of England itself. On one side were the Royalists, those loyal to the king, who believed in the divine right of monarchy. On the other side were the parliamentarians, led by figures like Oliver Cromwell, who believed that power should rest with Parliament, not the crown. The war was a brutal conflict that tore families apart and divided the kingdom. The parliamentarians, eventually emerging victorious, captured Charles I, put him on trial for treason, and executed him in 1649, marking the first time in British history that a reigning monarch had been overthrown and executed. The execution of Charles I set the stage for the establishment of the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell, who effectively became the ruler of England. Cromwell's time in power was marked by a period of military dictatorship, and though he abolished the monarchy, England was far from stable. His rule, though based on the ideals of Puritanism and republicanism, was fraught with contradictions. He sought to create a godly republic, but his iron-fisted rule left many questioning the cost of such ideals. After Cromwell's death in 1658, England was once again plunged into political chaos. His son, Richard Cromwell, failed to maintain control, and in 1660, the monarchy was restored with the coronation of Charles II. The restoration of the monarchy under Charles II marked the return of the Stuarts to power, but the monarchy that emerged was forever altered by the events of the Civil War. The Stuarts could no longer claim absolute power over England. The English Civil War and the execution of Charles I had permanently shifted the balance of power, and the idea of constitutional monarchy began to take shape. Charles II, though a monarch by title, was keenly aware that his authority was now limited. The restoration of the monarchy was also marked by the rise of political factions, Whigs and Tories, that would shape English politics for centuries to come. Yet, even as the monarchy was restored, the tensions between king and parliament remained. The reign of Charles II, known as the Merry Monarch, was a period of relative stability after the chaos of the Commonwealth years. But his successor, James II, would ignite yet another crisis. James, a Catholic in a predominantly Protestant England, sought to increase his power and reintroduce Catholicism. His attempts to do so led to widespread fear and unrest. In 1688, a group of nobles, fearful of a Catholic dynasty, invited William of Orange, a Protestant and the husband of James's daughter, Mary, to invade England. William's forces landed in England, and James, realizing he had lost the support of both his army and the people, fled to France. This bloodless revolution became known as the Glorious Revolution, and it marked the end of absolute monarchy in England. With the overthrow of James II, William and Mary ascended to the throne, but they did so under strict conditions. The Bill of Rights, passed in 1689, cemented the idea of constitutional monarchy in England, limiting the powers of the king and ensuring that Parliament would play a central role in the governance of the country. This marked the beginning of the modern British state, one where the monarchy was no longer the absolute ruler, but instead a ceremonial figurehead, with real power resting in the hands of elected representatives. The rise of the British Empire. The Glorious Revolution had not only altered the political landscape of England, but also set the stage for the expansion of British power on the global stage. As the power of the monarchy waned, the power of Parliament and the growing merchant class began to rise. England, with its newfound political stability and growing financial influence, began to turn its attention outward, towards the seas. The stage was set for the rise of the British Empire, the largest and most influential empire the world would ever know. The early years of the 18th century saw Britain emerge as a dominant maritime power. The British Navy, long a force to be reckoned with, began to expand, protecting British trade routes and securing colonies around the world. The establishment of colonies in the Americas, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa laid the groundwork for the empire that would soon span the globe. Britain's mercantile economy, fueled by its expanding colonies, began to thrive, and the country's influence in world affairs grew exponentially. But the empire's rise was not without its challenges. The 7 Years' War, 1756–1763, marked a turning point in British history. Fought against France, Spain, and other European powers, the war saw Britain solidify its control over vast territories, including Canada and India, while weakening France's colonial holdings. The war's cost was enormous, and Britain turned to its colonies to help shoulder the financial burden. This would lead to rising tensions between Britain and its American colonies, particularly as the British government sought to impose taxes and controls on trade. The result was the American Revolution, which broke out in 1775 as the American colonies fought for independence. The Revolution, though a devastating blow to British power, was also a defining moment in the history of the British Empire. It marked the first time a colony successfully broke free from British rule, and it forced Britain to reevaluate its approach to empire. The loss of the American colonies did not end the British Empire, however. It would continue to expand into Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, eventually controlling vast territories that spanned across every continent. In the 19th century, the British Empire reached its zenith. The Industrial Revolution, which had transformed Britain into the world's leading industrial power, gave the British Empire the economic and military might to dominate the world. The British Navy controlled the seas, and British merchants and traders established a global network of commerce. British influence was felt in every corner of the globe, from the opium trade in China to the plantation economy in the Caribbean. The empire's reach was vast, and its wealth was unparalleled. Yet, the empire's dominance was not without its costs. The exploitation of colonies, the brutality of imperial conquest, and the oppression of indigenous populations left scars that would never fully heal. The British Empire was built on the backs of slaves and colonized peoples, and its legacy is one of both pride and shame. While it brought wealth and power to Britain, it also left behind a legacy of exploitation and inequality that continues to shape global politics today. The Industrial Revolution and the changing face of Britain. The 19th century was a time of profound change, both for Britain and the world. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century, transformed Britain from a largely agrarian society into the world's leading industrial power. It was a revolution that affected every aspect of life, from the way goods were produced to the way people lived. The rise of factories, railways, and steam engines changed the landscape of Britain and the lives of its people. It was an era of unprecedented growth and innovation, but also one of great social upheaval. At the heart of the Industrial Revolution was the development of new technologies that revolutionized manufacturing. The invention of the steam engine, first perfected by James Watt, allowed for the mechanization of factories, which in turn led to a boom in production. The creation of railroads, powered by steam, allowed for the transport of goods and people across the country with unprecedented speed and efficiency. This led to the rise of industrial cities, where factories and workers were concentrated in close proximity. Cities like Manchester and Birmingham became symbols of the industrial age, teeming with workers who lived in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. While the Industrial Revolution brought great wealth and power to Britain, it also exposed the deep inequalities that existed within society. The rise of industry led to the creation of a new working class, whose labor powered the machines of progress. But this new class of workers often lived in squalor, enduring long hours, low wages, and unsafe working conditions. The stark contrast between the wealth of factory owners and the poverty of workers sparked social and political movements aimed at reform. The fight for workers' rights, child labor laws, and better living conditions became central to British politics in the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution also had a profound impact on Britain's empire. The growth of industry created a demand for raw materials, and British factories looked to the colonies to supply them. The empire's vast network of colonies became essential to Britain's industrial economy, supplying everything from cotton to minerals to rubber. The rise of industry allowed Britain to maintain its dominance in the global marketplace, but it also deepened its dependence on the resources of its colonies. The exploitation of these resources, often at the expense of indigenous populations, left a dark legacy that would continue to haunt the empire for years to come. The decline of the empire and the birth of modern Britain. The 20th century saw the decline of the British Empire as the world that had been shaped by imperialism began to change. The aftermath of World War II, with its enormous cost in lives and resources, signaled the end of Britain's dominance on the world stage. The empire, once vast and unyielding, began to unravel as colonies sought independence. India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, gained its independence in 1947, followed by many other colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia. The decline of the empire was not a sudden event, but a gradual process, driven by both external pressures and internal contradictions. The cost of maintaining an empire, both financially and politically, had become too great for Britain to bear. The rise of nationalist movements in the colonies, combined with the changing global order, forced Britain to reconsider its role in the world. The empire that had once stretched across the globe now began to shrink, and Britain was forced to adapt to its new reality. In the wake of decolonization, Britain faced significant challenges at home. The loss of its empire forced Britain to redefine its place in the world, and the country's post-war economy was in tatters. Yet, despite the challenges, Britain emerged from the 20th century as a modern, industrialized nation, with a strong cultural influence and a place in global affairs. The British Empire, though gone, left an indelible mark on the world. Its legacy can be seen in the global spread of the English language, the institutions it established, and the cultures it shaped. Yet the empire's history is also marked by exploitation, inequality, and injustice. The history of Britain, from its ancient roots to its imperial grandeur, is one of both triumph and tragedy, of a kingdom that rose from the ashes of conquest and built an empire that changed the world, but whose legacy continues to shape the global landscape today. Reflections on a legacy. The history of Great Britain is a tale of transformation, of resilience and reinvention, a narrative that spans centuries and continents. From the first Roman invasions to the rise of the Anglo-Saxons, From the Norman conquest to the empire that spanned the globe, the journey of this small island nation has shaped the course of history in ways both expected and unexpected. Today, the legacy of Britain's past is present in its institutions, its culture, and its place in the world. The echoes of its empire still reverberate in global politics, while its democratic traditions continue to influence governments across the world. But the history of Britain is also a history of challenges of war, division, and the constant struggle for identity. It is a history that, like all great histories, is far from over. As we look to the future, we must ask ourselves, what will the next chapter in Britain's history look like? How will the country continue to evolve, to adapt, and to redefine itself in a rapidly changing world? One thing is certain, whatever happens, Britain's story will remain one of the most fascinating, complex, and enduring narratives in the annals of history.